Welcome to Ely, a beautiful ancient city that was once upon a time its own island, separate to mainland Great Britain. Though nowadays surrounded by the lush countryside of eastern England's Fens, traces of Ely's lengthy history are to be found all over the modern city. And on this walk, we'll stroll through the centuries as we pass by a variety of enchanting historic buildings, walk under the shadow of Ely's more than 900-year-old cathedral, weave our way through a maze of historic streets and lanes, stroll through the park where this city hosts the World Eel Throwing Competition, and take in some delightful riverside views beside the tranquil River Great Ouse. All of that is to come over the next 40 minutes as we make our way around Ely. But we begin on the delightful St Mary's Green, surrounded by a wealth of quaint and historic buildings on all sides, one of which even served as the home of one of England's most significant historical figures. The timber-framed building in front of us here is one of the oldest in Ely, originally built over 750 years ago in the 13th century. But it was in the 17th century that it was lived in by none other than Oliver Cromwell and his family. Cromwell, born in the nearby town of Huntingdon in 1599, lived in a number of towns all over this region of England, sometimes referred to as Cromwell country. But this is the only house of his in the region which remains standing to this day. A surprisingly welcoming statue of Cromwell and his wife Elizabeth stands outside this house, now open to visitors to explore, though the Cromwells are of course less remembered for their homemaking, as it was during their time in this house in Ely that they emerged as one of Britain's most significant families. Oliver Cromwell lived here between 1636, when he was left this house by his uncle, and 1646, by which time he had risen to become the leader of the fight against King Charles I in the English Civil War. While Cromwell travelled all across Great Britain during this period, this humble house was home to the man who would later go on to be king in all but name of the Republican Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. During his time as Lord Protector, Cromwell moved from this house to reside at the Grand Whitehall Palace in central London. But here we can see the area which he once called home, with his house neighboured by the historic St Mary's Church here, also built back in the 13th century. Now Cromwell's house just next door was originally built as the vicarage of St Mary's Church, that being the residence of church priests, although at the time Cromwell moved in, he was no priest. Instead, an out-of-work MP, moonlighting as a small-scale farmer and local tax collector, after King Charles I had controversially dismissed Parliament 7 years earlier in 1629, and was ruling with absolute authority. If you visit Oliver Cromwell's house in Ely, you can discover even more about his career and legacy, still much debated across the country to this day, while the house he lived in has also been refurbished with an extensive Civil War exhibition, making it well worth the visit. Of course though, there's much more to Ely than just one of its former residents, and while the delightful green here has the appearance of a small countryside village, Ely is unquestionably a city, as this coat of arms tells us. Now Ely isn't the largest of cities, home to around 20,000 people in the modern day, but once upon a time it was one of the most significant settlements in all of eastern England, holding the status of a city as it was home to a great cathedral, which looms over Ely just a short distance away. We'll take a detailed look at Ely Cathedral in a few minutes' time, but as we make our way off St Mary's Green, to really get an understanding of how this place came to hold such great significance, we need to take a look at a couple of maps. On the left is Ely's location in the 21st century, just 15 miles north of Cambridge, while on the right is the same map but over 1,000 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon period, when Ely was an island surrounded by sea or swampy land lying underwater. That area of land is known as the Fens, and it remained mostly underwater until as recently as the 17th century. And so this place, for much of its history, was known as the Isle of Ely, situated on the highest area of land in the Fens on which the cathedral was built. The name of the modern city even means the Isle of Eels, as Ely has for centuries also been closely associated with the slippery fish, as we'll talk more about later. Eels aren't the only thing symbolic of Ely though, as here in the shadow of the city's cathedral, we encounter a great cannon, which has stood here since 1860. It's one of many so-called Sevastopol cannons that you'll find around Britain, captured by the British Army from the Russians during the Crimean War, and this one was later gifted to Ely by none other than Queen Victoria, in recognition of the formation of the local Ely Rifles Volunteer Corps. Despite being more than 150 years old, the cannon is probably the newest landmark to be found in this part of Ely, the historic heart of this ancient city. Of course, the cathedral in front of us here is the oldest and most prominent landmark in the centre of Ely, but there are plenty more centuries-old buildings that surround it. Ely's origins can be traced back 1,350 years to 673 AD, when the Anglo-Saxon St Etheldreda founded a Christian community of monks and nuns on top of the hill where the cathedral now stands. Nothing remains of that original settlement, but just in the shadow of the cathedral here, there stands the grand old Bishop's Palace, built back in the 15th century, and which served as the residence of the Bishop of Ely all the way from then until 1941. Though nowadays, the bishop has moved across the road to a smaller residence, while his old palace is now used by the prestigious King's Ely, one of the world's oldest schools, founded 1,053 years ago in the year 970 AD. Later on, we'll make our way between the buildings of Kings and explore its own lengthy history. But here, we now find ourselves looking up at the great tower of the beautiful Ely Cathedral. One of the grandest and most elegant cathedrals in the country, Ely Cathedral also draws its origins from a church founded by St Etheldreda in the 7th century. But the building as we see it today is a little newer, built over the course of 100 years between the late 11th and 12th centuries. Construction began on the modern cathedral just 15 years after the Battle of Hastings in 1081, and as such it's one of the best examples of grand Norman architecture brought over by the forces of William the Conqueror at a time of great upheaval in England. Set in the centre of what is a fairly small city, Ely Cathedral feels all the more immense, so huge in fact that it's for centuries been visible for miles around across the flat landscape of the Fens. Of course, nowadays, you can admire Ely Cathedral either up close here, or from a distance in the surrounding countryside. But when this was an island surrounded by water, the cathedral was known as the Ship of the Fens, looking like a great ship surrounded by the sea when viewed from a distance. Now, despite its pristine condition and lengthy history, Ely Cathedral has changed a little over the centuries since it was first built. Here, we're looking at the Octagon Tower, added to the cathedral in the 14th century after the old Norman central tower collapsed in what monks thought at the time to be an earthquake. Built over 18 years from 1322, the Octagon Tower is topped by a lantern that acted much like a lighthouse, and it was designed to be sturdier than the previous Norman tower. But its structure was notably built of wood, as a stone tower was too heavy to be supported. The Octagon Tower, with its intricate architecture and eye-catching stained glass windows, is the ultimate feature to explore when you visit the cathedral, one of the very best things to do on a day out in Ely. And we'll take in more views of this great medieval church from a different angle in a few minutes' time. However, it's now time to make our way out of the historic grounds of the cathedral through this, the fetching Steeple Gateway, built back in the Tudor period to link the cathedral with Ely's historic High Street. Once upon a time, pilgrims visiting the cathedral on the Isle of Ely would have walked through this gateway from the civilian streets of the city, which developed over the centuries surrounding the original community established by St Etheldreda over 1300 years ago. Before the Norman cathedral, the Anglo-Saxon monastery that existed in Ely grew into the second wealthiest in all of England, and this wealth contributed to the growth of the monastery and its needs, everything from basic maintenance work to trading links. And so a civilian community, who could carry out all this work, began to develop on the outskirts of the monastery. That civilian community gave birth to the streets that we're walking on here, which surround the cathedral and the former monastery, with houses, workshops and a market square developed as Ely's prosperous economy went from strength to strength through the medieval period. although that economy was still dominated by the monastery and its members. Here we're passing by the Sacrist's Gate, built in 1325, which also links the High Street with the Cathedral, and which runs beneath the historic Goldsmith's Tower, once upon a time home to a goldsmith's workshop. Now these stand in the middle of a long row of historic buildings which back onto the High Street, and which are collectively known as the Sacristy, which take their name from the Sacrist, a local tradesman who was responsible for the upkeep of the monastery's buildings. Conveniently, therefore, the Sacristy faced both onto the civilian and monastic districts of Ely city centre. Now, despite being officially separated by these buildings and the historic gateways, the largest of which we'll see later on, these two communities were still closely intertwined. Now, the 14th century Sacristy overlooks Ely's narrow high street, the other side of which is lined with buildings that look rather newer, although a number are actually 16th century timber-framed houses that have been refitted with more modern facades. We'll stroll between the historic buildings lining the High Street and Market Street later on. But back on the other side of the road next to the Sacristy is a long row of even older buildings known as the Almonry, built back in the 13th century. Historically, the Almonry was the domain of the almoner, a church official who distributed alms to the people of Ely, alms being donations in the form of food, clothes, and other such items for people's well-being. For centuries, Ely's poor and vulnerable would crowd around the gates of the almonry that we can see here awaiting alms provided by the church, although nowadays the almonry is home to one of Ely's most popular restaurants and tea houses, a popular spot with visitors to the city. We'll walk through the beautiful grounds of the Almonry in a couple of minutes, but stretching out just outside its old gates here, we find Ely's historic market square. Now, markets have been taking place in Ely for over 800 years, thought to have begun as early as the year 1216, with markets serving both locals here on the island and people from the surrounding region, who would either travel to Ely through the swamps and sea on boats, or via an old Roman road known as the Fen Causeway, built across the water and which connected Ely with mainland towns like Cambridge. Nowadays, this part of Ely is much different. The Cloisters shopping centre, for example, was opened in 1999, although traditional markets are still held on the marketplace 3 times a week, on Thursdays, Saturdays and Sundays, selling everything from fresh produce to craft items and street food. But back in the era when this was a market on an island, what exactly did traders have to sell? Well, the Isle of Ely wasn't exactly small, measuring 7 miles in length by 4 miles in width, and the land that stood above the water was particularly fertile, allowing for the cultivation of crops like corn, and notably sedge plants, which grew plentifully in the marshy lands across the region, and were traditionally used as a herbal infusion in teas around eastern England, particularly Norfolk. The monks, meanwhile, operated vineyards which grew in scale over the centuries, and of course, being surrounded by water, the island's market stalls were often filled with fish and of course eels. Now, just off the market square, embedded into the old walls of the Almonry, we find the city's captivating war memorial, dedicated to the locals who lost their lives fighting in the First and Second World Wars, many having been members of the Ely Rifle Volunteer Corps, who were awarded the Sevastopol cannon that we saw earlier. Now, given its location in the heart of the Cambridgeshire countryside, the main impact of the World Wars on Ely was the loss of its men, and in the Second World War, its role as a destination for many evacuees from big cities like London, serving as a haven from the bombs of the Blitz. Just beside the war memorial on the Almonry wall, however, we can see 2 more symbols of the city, a small green eel on the right, and on the left, the crest of the Dean of Ely, associated with the cathedral. The Dean's crest and its 3 keys have uncertain origins, but the eel is something which to this day remains a famous symbol of this city. As we now make our way into the Almonry Gardens, we mentioned earlier that Ely's name likely means the Isle of Eels, and that's because eels were particularly abundant swimming in the waters surrounding the island, and eel fishing, therefore, was big business in the city. However, as strange as it may sound, eels weren't just caught to be sold as food, as in the medieval era, eels were actually used as a common form of currency. Now, eels were everywhere in medieval England, in ponds and rivers up and down the country, and this plentiful supply of the fish meant that they were extremely common as a food. More eels were eaten in the Middle Ages, in fact, than any other type of fish. And it was their abundance and nutritional value that led them to being used as money as well. Until around the 16th century, hundreds of thousands of eels were used by people to pay for things, most notably rents. And in Ely, it was the monastery which charged these rents to those living and farming on the lands of the island. Of course, most of these eels used as money weren't taken straight out of the river and handed to a landlord. In fact, one of the other great properties of these slippery fish is that they were extremely easy to preserve through smoking and drying. And so you could hold on to one eel, a bind of eels, that being 10, or even a stick, 25, for months on end. This durability made eels a viable currency for all, and people would then receive dried or smoked eels as payment and hold on to them as food to be eaten in the winter, when there was little fresh produce about. But for Ely in particular, eels were of great significance to the city's monks, as during the period of Lent, the period of fasting in the lead up to Easter, monks were allowed to eat eels. Once again then, we find ourselves within the grounds of the great Ely Cathedral, which just gets bigger and bigger every time you look at it. And it was in these grounds that the city's monks would ply their trades and dedicate themselves to God all year round, sustained during Lent by eels. But why were eels allowed during this time of fasting? Well, during Lent, the eating of meat is traditionally forbidden on Fridays, but this doesn't include fish. There are plenty of reasons suggested for this rule, ranging from the relative rarity of red meats, meaning that foregoing them meant giving up a luxury, to the idea that Jesus sacrificed his flesh on Good Friday, and so avoiding meat on the Fridays of Lent honours him. But fish, plentiful in the seas, was permitted, and in England, eels were very much the order of the day, making them the perfect food to sustain people through Lent. There's much more to Ely's connection with eels though, a city so closely tied with the fish that it's even the home of an annual eel festival and the World Eel Throwing Competition. And we'll talk more about these delightful traditions a little bit later when we reach the riverside. However, we've made our way back out of the cathedral grounds through the Sacrist's gate and onto the High Street once again. But from here, we're going to make our way towards Market Street by way of a lovely little lane between the buildings. As the civilian settlement of Ely developed on the outskirts of the monastery, it was opportune for people to be located as close to the monastery as possible. And so while even then it was by no means a huge place, by 1563 there were around 800 households located on the island, this area was very densely populated. Here on the narrow High Street passage, modern shops are housed within buildings dating back to between the 15th and 19th centuries. Although this was a period when Ely was suddenly thrust into a world without its highly significant monastery. Established all the way back in the 7th century, Ely's monastery dominated the city for around 800 years, until it was eventually closed down on the orders of King Henry VIII in 1539, during his sweeping campaign known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries. This led to the gradual decline of Ely from one of the most significant and wealthiest places in the region, although the city did retain its position as a place of trade, connected to the mainland by causeways across the water. But in the 17th century, Ely's historic status as an island even changed too, as a group of wealthy landowners, under the direction of King Charles I, began an operation to entirely drain the Fens, turning swamp and sea into lush, fertile land that could be used for agriculture. This was highly controversial at the time, principally among locals who were outraged that the draining of the Fens would destroy their historic fishing industries. In fact, opposition was so fierce across the Fens that it even led to a guerrilla campaign of sabotage by the so-called Fen Tigers, angry locals who destroyed dikes and ditches designed to drain the swamps. Despite this, however, the Fens were almost entirely drained by the late 17th century, and this opened up a new opportunity for local commerce, with a number of new pubs, taverns and coaching inns opened in the city to cater to travellers, now making their way over land through Ely in the direction of Cambridge, London, Norwich and more. Market Street here was typically the departure point for long-distance stagecoaches departing the now mainland city of Ely. Although, as we'll see just around the corner, there were coaching inns too when Ely was an island. Otherwise, Ely developed a modest industrial sphere, but remained small in line with its historic isolation, and that remains the case to this day. It's been quite the journey from the city's foundation 1300 years ago, and just across the road, we can see a building where you can learn even more about that journey, ELY Museum. Now interestingly, ELY Museum is actually housed within the city's former jailhouse, originally built all the way back in the 13th century, and which was used as the place where local prisoners were held for nearly 200 years, between 1679 and 1836. The jail was converted into the city's museum much more recently in 1997, and it's a lovely place where you can discover Ely's unique history in depth, covering everything from its development from Anglo-Saxon island monastery to one of England's most delightful cities of all in the modern day. As I think you'll agree from all we've seen so far, Ely is full of beautiful buildings, streets and green spaces, and with expansive countryside surrounding the city on all sides, as well as the railway providing direct links to nearby cities as well as London, Ely has been regularly ranked as one of the best places of all to live in England. By population, this is of course the 5th smallest city in England, which as we mentioned earlier, gives it more the feel of a countryside market town. But there are plenty of lovely places to discover if you live here, or even just visit for the day, like the Lamb Inn here, one of central Ely's largest and oldest pubs, dating all the way back to the 15th century. The Lamb was originally built as a coaching inn back in the era before the Fens were drained, and while Ely was still an island, situated in the shadow of the Cathedral Tower and on a busy crossroads between the High Street and Lynn Road, which heads north out of the city centre in the direction of King's Lynn. King's Lynn, once upon a time one of England's most important ports, became linked to Ely by river in the 15th century, when the River Great Ouse was diverted from its natural route to empty into the Wash at King's Lynn, and this helped to make the river much more easily navigable for trading boats heading further inland. River trade, therefore, became an important part of Ely's economy through the centuries, and while the river is no longer used for much trade today, it remains an important waterway in this part of the country, and we'll take a walk alongside the delightful riverside towpath in Ely a little later on in our walk. However, as we pass by the historic Minster Tavern, said to be the oldest pub in Ely, we return once again to the immediate surroundings of Ely Cathedral. Now, once upon a time, when this area was home to a monastery, these grounds were closed off from the rest of the city, by gates like the Sacrist Gate and Steeple Gateway, and by buildings that surrounded what is now known as the Cathedral Close. Ely's Cathedral Close, though not the largest in the country, is still a notable place, and it's home to the largest collection of domestic monastic buildings in England, ranging from the place where the Bishop of Ely used to reside, to the former Prior's house, an old monastic infirmary and more, and most are located just on the other side of the cathedral from where we are here. As we know, the monastery was dissolved in 1539 by Henry VIII, but the church which once served it remains standing in beautiful condition to this day, sensitively restored in the Victorian period by the architect George Gilbert Scott, the man who designed over 800 buildings around the country, including the famous Midland Grand Hotel at London's St Pancras Station. Having survived through centuries of history, Ely Cathedral today is open to visitors, and you can enter the cathedral through the immense doors here of the Galilee Porch, which was historically the place where people repenting their sins would wait before being admitted to the church's interior. This porch is one of the oldest parts of the whole cathedral, built in the late 12th century, just after the West Tower directly above us was built, and is yet another stunning example of eye-catching Gothic architecture, which really stands out when viewed both from up close and from afar. In a couple of minutes' time, we'll make our way past the old site of Ely Castle, another prominent mound that towered above the rest of the flat fens, and from the castle mound, we'll be able to get a much better view of this cathedral from afar, where it's especially clear why the building was known for a long time as the Ship of the Fens. Now though, it's time to head away from the historic Cathedral Close, and in the direction of Ely's beautiful riverside, which we'll reach in around 10 minutes. On the way though, we'll pass plenty more captivating historic landmarks, and here we're walking onto a street that's full of them. This is the Gallery, historically located within the complex of the old monastery, and which is home to grand medieval buildings like the old Great Hall, which we can see just over this wall, built back in the 13th century, and which nowadays is the modern place of residence for the Bishop of Ely, after he moved from the much larger Bishop's Palace in 1941. There's been a Bishop of Ely since the year 1109, and as such the position is now one of the most senior in the Church of England, although this city's bishop is perhaps best known as an important figure in the history of a famous educational institution nearby. Not King's Ely, but the University of Cambridge. The University of Cambridge was established in 1209, but as it grew in size, it began to develop a system of colleges that exists to this day. And the very first college, the prestigious Peterhouse, was established by none other than the Bishop of Ely in 1284. So Ely can rightfully claim to have formed an integral part in developing one of the world's most prestigious universities. But within the old monastery complex in this city nowadays are the buildings of one of the world's oldest and one of Britain's most prestigious schools, King's Ely. As we mentioned earlier, King's Ely was established 1053 years ago in the year 970 AD, when it was opened as a place to educate the young boys who sang in the Christian community founded by St Etheldreda. Through all that time, King's Ely has only grown in stature. In the 11th century, it was the place where Edward the Confessor, one of the last Anglo-Saxon kings of England, went to school. And in 1541, after the closure of the monastery with which it was historically linked, the school was refounded by King Henry VIII, giving it the name King's. Nowadays, King's Ely is home to over 1,000 students, including both boys and girls and day schoolers and boarders, and the majority of the school buildings are located in a calm area of the city centre, at the bottom of the gallery around Barton Square, a particularly fetching campus that's also home to this immense gateway. This is the Ely Porta, historically the main entrance to the monastery located on the hilltop, and it was built over 21 years from 1396 to 1417. Still looming large in the city today, the Ely Porta, also known as Walpole's Gate after the Prior Walpole, was the place where most people arriving in the city would make their way into the most sacred place on the Isle of Ely. Everybody from civilian pilgrims to members of the nobility and even monarchs of the realm. With this part of Ely dominated by the school, the Ely Porta too is now used by kings. In fact, the school magazine is even known as the Porta. But while it's mainly students that walk through the historic gateway between classes, the Porta affords us an easy link from the historic heart of Ely with the spacious grounds of Cherry Hill Park, home to the mound of the historic Ely Castle and some stunning views of Ely Cathedral. Making our way through the Great Gateway to enter the park, this area also gives us an opportunity to better understand why exactly the Isle of Ely came into existence in the first place, when the surrounding fens remained flooded for centuries. As we mentioned, the Isle of Ely is the highest point of land in the fens, with the cathedral standing a dizzying 85 feet, or 26 metres above sea level. That's practically a mountain around these parts. And the reason that the ground here is so relatively high is that it was formed by a large deposit of clay tens of millions of years ago during the Mesozoic era. As you might remember from the old map we saw earlier, this wasn't the only island in the fens. Clay deposits created a number of smaller islands elsewhere where villages and towns developed. But the Isle of Ely was certainly the most prominent in the region, and as such the great cathedral that stood on top of it was visible for miles and miles and miles around. And here, looking across the undulating terrain of the park, we can see exactly why Ely Cathedral was known as the Ship of the Fens. Its great towers and long profile giving the impression of a great ship floating above the watery lands all around it. Of course, as well as the surrounding waters, the high ground here provided a degree of extra protection to the community that developed on the Isle of Ely. Apart from a brief attack by Danish raiders in the 9th century, Ely's Anglo-Saxon monastery had the space to develop without much outside threat, and the island became notoriously difficult to capture in military conflict. Even so, Ely was also home to a castle, which existed just here opposite the Cathedral, atop the forested mound we're walking past now. Known locally as Cherry Hill, the castle that stood here was actually demolished over 700 years ago, after being originally built around the year 1070 by none other than William the Conqueror, who did the seemingly impossible and captured the Isle of Ely in conflict. After victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William and his Norman armies set about cementing their authority all over England, but encountered fierce resistance in the north and east in particular. Intense campaigns were staged in order to subdue opposition in the likes of Norwich and Cambridge, but Ely, as an island, was a particular headache, defended by the Anglo-Saxon noble and notorious resistance leader, Hereward the Wake. After the Norman invasion of England, Hereward the Wake, whose name means Hereward the Wary, roamed the Fens, gaining popular support for a resistance campaign, and he used the Isle of Ely as his base, possibly in alliance with the armies of the Danish king. Initially, Hereward and his allies were able to push the Normans back as they fiercely defended East Anglia, but William eventually sent a larger army to deal with the rebels, who were quickly pushed back themselves to this island, where they staged a last-ditch fight against the conqueror. Unfortunately for Hereward and the rebels, they hadn't proved especially popular on the island with Ely's historic community of monks, and it's thought that the monks, when bribed by William's forces, gave over the secrets to capture the Isle of Ely, which eventually fell, and William built a castle to ensure that the island remained subdued to his rule. Having made our way through Cherry Hill Park now though, just across the road we find another, much more modern park, the delightful Jubilee Gardens, which are our path to the riverside. However, before we get to the river, the Jubilee Gardens are their own captivating treasure trove of history and traditions. Opened in 2002 on the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, Ely's Jubilee Gardens were for most of their history an integral part of Ely's waterborne trade, located just beside the River Great Ouse. Barges used to dock in specially dug channels where the park exists today, transporting everything from the crops grown on the island to stone used for the building of the cathedral, while a variety of workshops and industrial yards surrounded this busy point of trade. In a couple of minutes, we'll see the last remaining of those historic industrial buildings. But over the centuries, the docks for barges were filled in, and this part of town was redeveloped into the delightful gardens we see now, which today play an important part in one of Ely's most unusual traditions. We mentioned earlier that Ely, in celebration of its historic association with eels, hosts an annual festival known as Ely Eel Day, typically held on the Saturday of the May Day bank holiday weekend. The first Eel Day was held back in 2004, and its main event is a big parade, which, of course including a big eel, makes its way all the way from the cathedral, through Jubilee Gardens here, to the riverside. This park then becomes the hub of Eel Day celebrations, principally as the venue for the traditional eel throwing competition. Now don't fret, no real eels are used in the eel throwing competition. In the festival's early days, throwers launched socks wrapped in tights across the grass, though nowadays there are specially made toy eels to use in competition. It's all a good bit of fun, but Ely has elected to title its main Eel Day event as the World Eel Throwing Competition, and you can participate if you're in town on the day. You get a couple of practice throws, and then the pressure's on with one chance to launch the so-called golden eel as far as you can. The world record for eel throwing, by the way, is a whopping 17.7 metres, set back in 2013 by a man called Simon, still unbeaten for nearly 10 years now. A wonderfully wacky celebration full of delightful eccentricities, the Eel Day festivities may only be less than 20 years old, but they're a wonderful way to see Ely celebrating its heritage to the full, and there's always an Ely good time had by all. My apologies, but anyway, we've now reached Ely's fabled riverside, one of the most beautiful parts of the city. As we mentioned, this is the River Great Ouse, which is actually the 5th longest river in the United Kingdom, flowing at least 143 miles all the way from near the border between Northamptonshire and Buckinghamshire to King's Lynn, where it empties out into the Wash. Once upon a time, this part of the river was filled to the brim with trade, though nowadays it looks almost like a canal, flowing tranquilly and surrounded by delightful scenery, with a large marina located just across the water from us here. You'll see canal boats galore on these wonderfully calm waters, the much modified river being particularly easy to navigate by boat, while this section of the river around Ely is also popularly used by rowers, boathouses just across the water here belonging to King's Ely and the University of Cambridge, whose elite rowers often train around here in preparation for the prestigious boat race against Oxford. Of course, the tranquility of the river has only come about with the decline of waterborne trade, but you can still find remnants of this area's industrial heritage alongside the river. As we mentioned, this area was once busy with trade, and a number of workshops, warehouses and yards surrounding the historic docks where the Jubilee Gardens now exist. And just here, we can see one of the last industrial buildings existing by Ely's riverside. This large building is known as the Maltings, built back in 1868 as a venue for the malting of barley. Malting, very simply, involves converting grain into malt by bathing it in water and subjecting it to high temperatures, after which point it can be taken to a brewery to be used in the making of beer. In 1971, this old malt house was converted into a public hall, but despite its closure, it's interesting to note Ely's long history when it comes to brewing. In fact, ales brewed on what was the Isle of Ely were sold in towns around the region back in the era of King Henry III in the 13th century, while the monks also operated breweries for much of the monastery's existence. There was even a brew house near the Ely Porta that we saw earlier. After the closure of the monastery, locally run breweries continued to operate, and served an important part of the local economy for centuries, exported nationwide, often by way of the river here. Now, the modern riverside is a wonderfully manicured part of Ely, lined by a number of delightful pubs, restaurants and houses, and also home to a number of intriguing monuments. Here, just outside the Maltings, is a soaring metal structure known as the Silver Eel Glaives, which depicts a glaive, a kind of spear that was historically used to catch eels. Glaives have been used by eel fishermen for centuries, thought to have originated in the Anglo-Saxon period, and they would have been a common sight around Ely once upon a time, although the use of these medieval spears for eel fishing was actually made illegal back in 1914. Just a couple of steps away from the Silver Eel Glaives, meanwhile, is another silver monument known as Sluice, placed here by the riverside in 2007. At night, Sluice is lit up in some rather lovely colours, but it depicts a sluice gate, a kind of mechanism used widely across the Fens to manage water levels. Acting not dissimilarly to a canal lock, sluice gates are just one of the ways that the Fens are able to stay unflooded in the modern day. When they were originally drained in the 17th century, the project was completed with the oversight of the Dutch engineer Cornelius Vermuyden, who built windmills all over the region, used as large pumps to lift water away from the ground. That's why you'll see so many windmills in eastern England. But nowadays, high riverside banks, sluice gates, and high-tech water level monitoring helps to keep the rivers from overflowing. Of course, as the Fens are below sea level, without all this active monitoring, they could easily flood once again, and Ely could return to being an island for the first time in centuries. But here's hoping that doesn't happen for the good of everybody living around the region. Still, from its days as an isolated but prosperous island all the way to the modern day, Ely is a city with a truly captivating history, home to everything from one of Britain's most beautiful cathedrals to an array of eye-catching streets, beautiful scenery and much more. However, as we walk alongside the river here, we've now sadly reached the end of our walk around Ely for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to paying a visit to Ely for yourself sometime soon.